Good evening. You are what? Good evening. You are warmly welcome to our last Talking Thursdays. October is Awareness Month, and we have had 4 Talking Thursdays. This is the last one. ADHD Europe is an umbrella organization with members across the Europe in 32 countries. Today, I have honor to present Finland, and my colleague from Sweden, Donnel, is going to be our guest speaker. I also have a crew, Richard from Belgium and Chantal from Belgium. So now I have to please note that our comments goes public and can be put on screen by our technical team. Now I give the virtual microphone to our guest speaker, Donnel from Sweden. Varsågod.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Inena, and hello everyone. I am Vice Chairman of Attention, the Swedish Interest Organization for ADHD and other related conditions. I also work in child and youth psychiatry as a nurse, and I also have a YouTube channel called Livet med NPF, Life with Neurodevelopmental Disorders, with strategies about ADHD, autism, Tourette's, defiant behavior, and more, with subtitles into most languages. So, we're going to talk about defiance in children. Not always easy, is it? No. Some children do find it more difficult than others to follow what is expected of them for at least periods of their lives. And for many, the difficulties persist into adulthood. Defiant behavior might sound like it's a deliberate choice of the child and puts the blame on the child, when it's really an inability to self-direct, a functional impairment, so to speak, dependent mostly of the same factors as ADHD. And nowadays, no one would dream of telling a child to stop that ADHD, or many people actually do that without thinking, but that's another presentation. Since ADHD and defiance are largely due to the same things, it's not that surprising that defiance often accompanies ADHD. About 60% of those with ADHD also meet the defiance syndrome diagnosis, ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. But what do you think? Maybe we should call it involuntary defiance to distinguish what it's really about. That is not something the child does on purpose. And dealing with involuntary defiance comes down to either motivating the child to do the right thing or teaching the child to do the right thing. And that depends on the method. I'm going to look briefly at both. Regardless, though, of the method, the path usually goes through the parents. And parental training has a good effect in about 80% of the cases. Children's periods of defiance aren't that wonderful generally. It's not something we will look back on in a few years and think, well, no, it's not actually. And the diagnosis ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, describes a pattern of negative, hostile, and defiant behavior that has lasted at least 6 months when interacting with at least one person who is not a sibling. That is, it's assumed siblings are fighting. Now, of course, you don't need to begin a complete defiant management program just because the child gets angry or cranky sometimes. However, Even if the child does not meet the criteria for ODD, there may be a need for strategies to deal with the difficulties, because this is often very exhausting for the child, the parents and siblings, as well as for staff in preschool and school. There are essentially two approaches in defiant management. One we might call the classical one, and the other is Ross Greene's CPS method. According to studies, the methods are about as effective when it comes to getting rid of defiant behavior, in around 80% of the cases. So perhaps mostly it's about which of them you feel is best fit for the child and the family. As usual, with this type of treatment, no treatment works perfectly for everyone. But they have a common denominator, and that's the emphasis on communication and interaction between the parents and the children, or the teachers and the children. We'll return to the methods a little bit later. So what does defiance look like for those lucky enough not to know? Well, an adapted definition, an accepted definition, is that it's a combination of where the child doesn't do what it's told within 1 minute. Whoever does that doesn't complete what's been told and violates known rules. It can be anything from whining to physical violence, but typically the child fights against the inevitable. Going to bed, getting dressed, going to preschool or school, though the latter most often has to do with anxiety, but that is also a different presentation. To be bad at controlling one's temper, to switch from happy to angry in seconds, breaking things when angry, to show a lack of respect for parents, teachers, and other adults, to refuse to obey just as intensely, be it small or big things, and to ignore reprimands. Defiance that lasts less than 6 months is usually classified as temporary defiance, at least if it's age appropriate, because it's a part of natural development process in the child. Most 2 or 3 or even 6 years olds defy and it passes. But if it doesn't go away within 6 months, or if the teenager throws himself on the floor and screams and kicks, well, then maybe we need to take a moment. Although adolescence itself can be a difficult journey. Someone said that when children are small, they're so cute you could eat them. When they become teenagers, you regret you didn't do it. But do we have to do something? Isn't it good if the child has a strong will? Absolutely. But if the life of the child and those around him is significantly worsened by it, it's probably a good idea to do something about it. Because defiant behavior can damage the child's relationship with parents, teachers, friends, future work and society at large. The child's chances, well, to get a good and happy life. And it can also become dangerous with escalating situations of defiance, power struggles and battles between children and parents, for instance. And untreated defiant behavior can sometimes develop into the more serious condition, conduct disorder, with severe violations of laws and norms. So yes, we probably should do something about it. But how do we as adults deal with defiance usually? With nagging and threats, right? We've all heard the parent in the grocery store with the child who refuses to go along. Bye, I'm leaving, and then pretend to leave. And the worst example I heard about was a dad with 3 children who were fighting in the back of the car. You should know that we had another child before, but we left him on the side of the road. Those kids didn't say a word the rest of the trip. Scolding, whining, yelling, nagging, and threats. And one day he appears, the dreaded kid, and we judge him harshly. But if we have been a part of him developing this way, or if he does not have the ability to do what we want, then maybe that's not so fair. He's also a child, and this is an adult responsibility. And here we quickly run into the low arousal approach, a method developed by the British psychologist Andrew MacDonald in the 80s. The method aims, as you might hear, to ensure that we don't inflame the situation with our response. Every now and then, someone questions the method, usually because central parts have been misunderstood, or maybe they're just annoyed that everyone is talking about it as a go-to solution, which it often is, I would say. But low arousal approach is nothing odd. On the contrary, it's so logical that it's almost a stretch to call it a method. Perhaps it's most obvious when we talk about affect and contagion. If you yell at me, I yell at you. If you whine at me, I whine at you. But if you smile at me, well, I'll probably smile at you. If I'm calm, you'll be calm. Affection is contagious. Whatever the feeling, negative or positive, a natural reaction is to reflect it. And that's why, among other things, we never should scold at a child. We only get scolding and other negative reactions in return. There are also no real scientific evidence that scolding pays. So a natural first step is to never more scold. Right? It's not that easy, might think. No, it's not. In fact, the thing that usually takes the longest time in classical defiant management is changing one's own communication. The part involving the child is actually quite easy. So easy that we tend to focus on that, and then we are surprised when the program no longer works because we have forgotten our own contribution. So screaming, scolding, and whining doesn't work. We know that somewhere, but we do it anyway in resignation or desperation when we don't have the tools to handle the situation. Low arousal approach doesn't mean that you shouldn't set boundaries, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't speak up, but it's about how you do it, and it's always about who we're dealing with, because no one method fits all. Kaplan Wheeler's assault cycle from 1983 is usually used to show how our ability to act will control, so to speak, is affected when we end up in effect. The curve is the effect level, and depending on the person, there is somewhere a limit for when the possibility of communication ends, usually somewhere during the escalation phase. And if it goes as far as the crisis phase without us being able to divert, we can only wait for it to pass. Everything we say only prolongs the phase. Depending on how sensitive the person is, the same applies to parts of the escalation and recovery phases. For children in defiance, the limit can be that low that if we don't stop the development of effect in the trigger phase, we have missed our chance. It can take 1.5 hours before the child is fully reachable, but typically is 30 to 40 minutes. It's often necessary not to miss what triggers the effect in order to have time to divert before we reach the crisis phase, and to be able to completely avoid the trigger next time, hopefully. But often as adults, we do something else rather than deflect. What is that? Well, we do the opposite. We start a power struggle and drive the escalation. It's like we're competing with the child to lose control first. And if even we as adults can't handle not winning, then we understand how difficult it is for a child. But whoever wins a power struggle, it's us as parents or teachers who have lost because we have deteriorated the contact with the child. So what do we do? If we win, the child is triggered further. If the child wins, he learns that it pays to defy. So we need to find a solution that does not make anyone a winner or a loser. And we need to evaluate what happened in each phase, and what we should do next time to, above all, interrupt the curve before it has reached the crisis phase, but also what we should do if we end up in the crisis phase. We formulate an action plan for every situation that arises. Were there demands on the child that triggered? And what help did the child get to cope with the demands? Were there other triggers? How do we avoid them next time? How did we try to slow down the escalation? How did the child try to slow it down? Did we do something that pushed it instead? And what did we do not to prolong the crisis phase, or did we do the opposite? And how did we try to facilitate the recovery, or did we make it even more difficult? Thankfully, it's usually quite easy to get rid of the triggers. We, so to speak, clean the environment from what usually triggers it. If we told the child 10 times about a certain thing and it still doesn't stop, then we probably have too high expectations of the child about that particular thing. Self-control is something that develops over time, and over quite a long time. Walter Bob has written many books about learning, but is best known for a quote: "If you've told a child 1,000 times and it still does not understand, then it's not the child who is the slow learner." Before we get into the methods, I thought I'd remind us of a few things that we all know but easily forget. It is, for example, easy to fall into a whining attitude where everything has to be complained about, even when it doesn't actually matter that much. And to avoid empty threats, because empty threats provokes and teaches the child to threaten themselves, and that your threats are usually empty. If you don't stop that, I will make more empty threats. And if you commit to something, you need to follow through. Be prepared for the situations that usually arise so that you don't have to improvise a half-baked response in the moment. And become the child's defense lawyer. Did the child really do it on purpose? Or what was it just too difficult a situation to handle? Or even an accident? Let's look for a moment at the classical method. It usually works with kids from the age of 2 and fully from around 4. But the most important preparatory parts have no age limit. And of course, it's possible to run the system even with 2 years olds. It's actually recommended if you intend to use it on siblings within 3 years. You just can't expect it to work fully, as a child can't do its part, really. And even if you don't end up using the classic method, there can be a lot of thoughts and strategies here that can be of great help anyway. There are well-tested and well-researched programs, and almost all parental management training programs, because it is the parent-child relationship that is of greatest importance here, is based on methods designed by Constance Hanff in the 60s. They differ in how the meetings are designed, whether there are videos, role-playing exercises, etc., but they are variations of the same theme and get comparable good results in studies. There are also a number of other less verified PMT methods based on the Hanff method. For example, COPE, which has become widespread, not least because it's cheap to implement, as it's done in groups. It makes it somewhat less effective since it's not tailored, but it can be sufficient when the difficulties are not that big. Another is Defiant Child or Defiant Children by Russell Barkley. It is the shortest of the programs, 8 weeks, and is intended to be carried out by the parents themselves in up to moderately difficult cases. And that's a program we will use as an example of classic defiance management tonight. Russell Barkley is, as you might know, a world-leading expert on ADHD and also an expert on defiance syndrome. He's trained more than 10,000 therapists worldwide in treatment of defiance problems. For the past 30 years or so, he has further developed Hanff's methods. The basic idea in classic method is that children want confirmation, attention, and predictability. But as parents, we often react irrationally to the child's communications and test runs. A small child receives praise when putting the bricks in the box, but over time the praise becomes increasingly sporadic at the best. But if the child hits the hammer through the window pane, then it gets full attention from the parent every time, and that's predictable attention. If the child can choose, it chooses, of course, positive attention, but the child cannot choose. It is we, as adults, who choose for the child. And we consistently seem to choose reward bad behavior with attention, but when it comes to positive behavior, we are far from as consistent. This, Have says, is the driving force behind defiance. This is how we built it up in those who have the aptitude for it. The child defies because it pays off for the moment, and that's all that matters. The child knows that it's inevitably had to put on shoes and jacket, but by defying, it can avoid it right now. Then the more you defy, the longer you can avoid it. The trick is to make sure it doesn't pay off even for the moment. That must be predictable for the child. The difficult thing as a parent and a teacher is usually to be consistent, reasonable, and predictable. And in order to manage this, it's important never to act on impulse, because the child must see that there are predictable rules that govern, not the whims of an angry parent or teacher, because that's not predictable. And if the child cannot see the consequences of a certain behavior, it cannot learn to avoid it. Being neutral with the child also makes it easier to start over with the child when it's all over. If you are several adults, you need to be in sync so that it still becomes consistent and predictable. And this is why defiant management is usually a bit more tricky if the child's parents are separated, and especially if they have poor contact, or if prestige between parents or teachers causes them to be out of sync, or not to hand over in time in those moments when you are unable to be neutral with a child. Barkley defines 4 decisive factors as the basis for the development of defiance: the child's personality, frustration, anger, impatience seems to be innate traits. The adult's personality, if, for example, you have a short fuse, black and white thinking, are easily stressed, and so on, or other characteristics that can make communication difficult. Previous interactions between the adult and the child, conflicts that the child has been involved in, build up a reference bank. Which behavior leads to which response? What usually leads to being able to escape from what I don't want to do, etc. And the 4th factor is family stressors. This includes physical and psychological problems, but also financial conditions, unemployment, relationship problems, etc. According to Barkley, previous interactions with the child are mainly about 3 things in terms of defiance development. As we covered earlier, we can encourage the child's negative behavior by giving it attention. And through our unpredictability, the child is encouraged to seek predictability even more, usually by exhibiting negative behavior. And by finally giving in, we teach the child that it pays to defy if you only do it long and hard enough. And children learn that you can get the reward faster if you skip the nagging and go straight for the tantrum, if that's what finally got the parent to give in last time. It can take quite a long time before a parent is ready to start with the child's part in a defiance management program. But it's like that with most things that are important, really important in life. It requires preparation. But then we can take comfort in the fact that the hard part has already been done without us even having to involve the child, that we have taken care of ourselves, even if it took doing it for someone else's sake. Now we stand here ready to let the curtain rise. But the child we meet might not be ready. It has certainly noticed the changes at home. Perhaps it has felt easier, more fun, but perhaps the child has no hopes that the positive change will last. So now it's time to hurry slowly, step by step. We must build the relationship so that your child follows along and feels that the whole thing is anchored, can be trusted. This is not a passing whim, and we must earn that trust. A defiance management program is not something that lasts a certain number of weeks and then it's done, but rather it takes a certain number of weeks to get it into place. For a few, it may be a one-time dose and then it's fine, except that we continue with improved communication. But a year or two with a program is not unusual, or as long as the need remains, it becomes a way of life for a time. But the programs don't usually mean that you put in more energy than you would have done without them. And in addition, the result will hopefully be a strengthened child and a harmonious relationship, instead of maybe the opposite. Barclay's 8-week program is about re-establishing the contact you had with the child from the very beginning. It is based on us giving more positive attention to the child. That the program emphasizes what we adults can change in our lives ourselves is not because our behavior would be the biggest cause of the child's behavior, of course not, but because it's the easiest thing to change. The program is made up of 8 weeks when we introduce new things almost every week, but it is preceded by the parents first getting ready for the program, taking care of themselves and the stressors that lie in the way. It can sometimes take months for parents to feel ready for week 1. But let's say we're there and we enter the first week, and what do we find there? A daddy with a cell phone. This is probably a not too uncommon picture in our homes today, although the mobile phone could just as easily have been something else that stole the parent from the child. So, what can the girl do here to get the father back? What would you do? Tell him about how fun it was today at school when Alice imitated a dog? Or take dad's phone, which had given the most contact with dad? Children want confirmation and want to feel approved by their parents, but as a child, you learn over time to get by without it. This first week of the program, we begin to change that. The child must see that the opportunity has returned and that it might be worth starting to pursuing it again. And the most important tool to achieve that is the focus quarters. 5 days a week, we devote a quarter of an hour to the child. One parent, one child. After a few weeks, we can reduce it to 3 to 4 times a week. We give undivided and uncritical attention to the child without directing. If I were to pick the most important part of this program, the one would be the one with the greatest effect. It would be these focus quarters. And when you hear that the program no longer works as well, then it's often these they have skimped on. In week 2, you have probably already seen a big difference in the first week. Now continue with the focus quarters 3 to 4 times per week. But now we also add praise. This is how it works. Be sure to praise the child as soon as it does what it's asked to. Get the child used to how easy it is to do what you ask by running sort of listening exercises or practice sessions where you ask for 5 to 6 simple things within a few minutes. Can you pass the butter, please? Can you turn on the light, please? Etc. And then you praise afterwards. If praise is not enough, we offer from week 3 reward. In half of the cases, the problems are mostly gone since we introduced this step. The principle here is that we give the child compensation for not doing what it would otherwise have done. But for children in defiance, you'll get a reward in 2 weeks. That's too far away. It's here and now that counts. Which leads us to chips or whatever you choose, the currency of the program. Children from 4 years old quickly learn the value of these chips when they understand what they might be exchanged for. Younger children usually need to have clear, direct rewards. Smaller things could be stickers or whatever they appreciate that is not so expensive. In the best of worlds, next week's step isn't needed. But for many kids, that's what's required, especially after some time with the system. Being able to lose chips, and maybe for really big infractions, lose a larger number of chips, which I believe is much better than time out, which I often think does more harm than good. When making these deductions, it's especially important that we do it in balance and as neutral as possible. We just follow the rules. We don't retaliate for bad behavior. The principle is that the deduction should be as large as the reward would otherwise have been. Week 5 is a week of evaluation. How does it feel? Good? Maybe fantastic? If not, you have to go over the various steps and see if you might have missed a step somewhere or in the communication. But even if the system works well at home, some may experience problems with maintaining the system when you're away from home. So in week 6, we add strategies such as have a plan ready for each place. What is expected of the child there and what happens if it is followed. A certain number of chips are given, for example, or if it's not followed, the same number of chips are drawn. Remind the child about the plan just before you arrive and then follow the plan. The system can easily be expanded to also include school or preschool once it's established at home. The same factors apply, of course, with communication and interaction, not encouraging defiance. The teacher reports to parents who adjust the chips at home. If you eventually, after a few months or years, begin to sense that you could manage without the chips, you tell the child that you should try without the chips for a couple of days, but that the child will still get the rewards if it continues to do the things it usually does to get it. If it works, you don't need the chips anymore. But if it goes off track, you put them back straight away. We're now taking a quick look at Barclay's version of the most widespread program worldwide for defiant management. And you might want to check his book. It's called Your Defiant Child. Barclay's defiant handling of youth is more about joint problem solving and social contracts, as teenagers might find chips too childish. If you're interested, check out Barclay's book, Your Defiant Teen. If you don't like this method, how it feels in the part that involves the child, then there are two options. Either it might be that the part is not even needed. Changing our communication and how we interact in other ways with the child may be enough. Or you might want to try the other method, the CPS method by Ross Greene. Ross Greene is an American child psychologist who believed that the classical method often does not work and that it can do more harm than good. He therefore developed his own program, the CPS method. CPS stands for Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, which is all about joint problem solving for children and parents. Solving problems and teaching the child the skills it lacks. Ross Greene is often on seminar tours, so go see him if you have a chance. I'll just briefly give you a picture of his methods. Working with joint problem solving and social contracts may require a higher degree of maturity in the child than with classic defiance management, where we only have to motivate the child to do what we think is the right thing to do. The basic idea in CPS is that children do the best they can and that problematic behaviors are a result of deficiencies in the cognitive abilities the child has, but needs to deal with everyday challenges. This is a mindset that many appreciate, and that is mainly why I speak of defiance as involuntary defiance. You do the best you can under given circumstances. And I would say that even if this weren't true, it's a very helpful thought for us adults to reduce conflicts and escalating defiance issues. Because there is, of course, a big difference for us in how we act if we think that the child is doing negative things deliberately or not. The structure of CPS is quite self-explanatory. We first change how we view the child. It's doing the best it can. It is not looking for attention. It's deliberately manipulative or is unmotivated to do the right thing, which is what classic defiance management is based on. If the child could behave, it would behave. The next step is to map what difficulties the child has and what demands or unresolved problems that are in conflict with these difficulties. This allows us to see in advance where we will probably have problems so that we can solve those problems in beforehand and avoid getting into problematic situations. Changing the way we look at the child is a bit of what we talked about earlier, actually, to become the child's defense lawyer and to see that this is perhaps something that the child is not ready for or to do. Ross Green also says that it's not the way adults act towards the child that contributes developing defiance behavior in those who has the aptitude for it by not being consistent or being too permissive, which classic management is saying, more or less. There is a big difference between children do the right thing if they can and children do the right thing if they want to, as classic defiance management means. Green also points out that it gets a little harsh if we try to motivate a child who is already motivated but just lacks the ability. So when we move to the CPS approach, we change our role from motivating a child to do the right things to find out why the child can't do the right thing and help the child with it. Because we focus on the fact that it's due to a developmental delay, that is all about cognitive dysfunction, difficulties with certain thought processes, handling frustrations, etc. Cognitive dysfunction, just like in ADHD, for instance. No surprise then that those 60% of those with ADHD also fulfill a defiance diagnosis, ODD. In those without ADD, only 6% meet an ODD diagnosis. The child usually doesn't defy all the time, but only in certain situations, often demanding situations of some kind, demands that the child is unable to meet, which requires flexibility and the ability to handle frustrations at a standard adult level. And we humans react differently when we find ourselves in a situation that we haven't got the ability to handle. Some become maybe silent and withdrawn, others scream and grumble or break things. And if we continue to confront and stress them, we can worsen the reaction. Low arousal approach again. We don't put gasoline on the fire. Ross Green talks about identifying which abilities in the child are lagging. For example, the ability to change activities or to maintain focus, typically ADHD traits. And about connecting to these lack of abilities, the unresolved problems for the child, the things that the child does not have the capacity to handle, and which results in the unwanted behavior. A list of examples of missing abilities and unresolved issues can be found on the website livesinthebalance.org. You see here next to me. Okay, say that through a lack of capability, we have identified a number of unsolved problems. The CPS method then defines 3 ways of handling the problems. A, we impose our own solution on the child. B, we decide together with the child how we will solve it. Or C, we postpone working on the problem for now, without first trying plan A or B. Why? Because we can't solve everything at once. We have to prioritize. Plan A might work fine with children who can do as they are told. Plan C is when the child does not do what we wish and we let it go for now Or even better, we don't bring it up at all if we are sure that the child would not do it anyway. But plan B is what CPS is all about. Collaborative, proactive solutions. So, how are we going to get the child to manage doing what we want? By teaching it skills it doesn't yet have. Plan B consists of 3 parts. The basic idea of Plan B is that it should be carried out before we get into the situation, that it is proactive. The first part in Plan B is about information gathering. We collect information from the child about how he or she sees the problematic situation, so that we can really understand the child's perspective. Formulating the problem means formulating how we as adults see the matter. And that can be a whole different ballgame, right? And the third part is to brainstorm about the problem. And in the last step on Plan B, we try to come up with as many solutions to the problem as possible, together with the child, where both wishes are accommodated. What we sometimes call the third way, where both are winners. We then select the solution that we can agree on has the best chance of success. And we try that first. And if it works, it means that both wishes have been met and no conflict arises and the child does not have to defy because we are trying to force him to do something that goes against what he wants. Ross Green's methods and thoughts on how to work with this can be found in his book, The Explosive Child. That was all we had planned for tonight to start any kind of questions. So if you have a question, I will try to answer it now. Maybe I have it in the chat or I will get it from Nina. I'm not sure, but we'll see. Out of date, not evidence based. Yes. Yes. This probably it's about the PMT methods, the parental management training I started with, Barkley, and there are a lot of them actually, but they're all based on the HANF method. It is like the Wonderful Years, Triple P, and so on, based on the same thing. And Ross Green, the latter, is a reaction to those earlier programs. But there actually has been studies on both of them as kind of removing the defiance. It works in 80% of the cases, whatever you choose. However, that doesn't say what you end up with. If the child has learned something or if we just have motivated the child. So there are a lot of studies on all of these programs, actually. Do we have any more questions coming up? Hello, Nina.
Hello, I jump in now because there has been listening, but there's no comments, so I can say that you clean the table?
That's great.
Yes, like you clean the table. And thank you very much. When I think the theme of October has been ADHD sharing and understanding experience. So I can say that we had a focus on education and behavior with positive approach, and I think it's very important to have a positive approach, and you gave us a good models for daily work, and I think it's coming all over the Europe that you the positive approach you get much longer. But
yeah,
this comment I took, yes, this comment I took up. So we know the trauma, and we always says that you have to also take care of the trauma same time when you take care of the ADHD.
Yeah.
So
correct.
Very good. But I think there's no questions anymore.
No.
I thank you, Eric. I thank you, Richard, and
Thank you.
Chantal, who was also here. And I invite our members to Helsinki to annual general meeting in next spring and hearing what's happening in Finland. And then I thank you, everybody who's been listening. You can also go to our broadcasting channel. There's a lot of information, and our websites, we inform you more. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you.